Leslie McGinnis is a doctoral candidate at the University of California at Berkeley, and she earned her BS degree at the University of Washington. And then she got it. Then she went and got her MS in ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and that is what she has continued her doctorate in at Cal Berkeley. Leslie firmly believes that science is for everyone, and she values research and research methods that are accessible to the general public and that honor the wealth of knowledge of gardeners, farmers, and backyard naturalists. And I love that. That's just wonderful. So without further ado, I'm going to let her take over. Thank you so much. So Leslie, you're going to share your screen.
Right.
Thank you.
And okay, is everything good?
Everything looks good. Thank you.
Great. So welcome to this presentation. I'm calling it Monarchs in the Garden, an exploration of Western monarchs and how to manage your own milkweed gardens. And again, I'm Leslie. And I want to first tell you a little bit about me. I guess you heard a little of the bio, but I grew up doing a lot of gardening myself in rural Eastern Washington outside Spokane. And then I went to University of Washington for my undergraduate degree and studied a variety of things from invasive plants and insects to tropical ecology to even killer whales. I was a science teacher in Los Angeles with Teach for America, and I taught middle school students and did a lot of outreach, taking them to camping and hiking field trips. And I went to the University of Michigan for my master's degree and had a lot of background in agroecology, so the ecology of agricultural systems. And I'm currently a doctoral candidate at the University of Berkeley, the University of California, Berkeley. And I call myself a crazy plant lady, and I love bug hunts. So next, I'd like to talk a little bit about how I came to be aware of this chapter and give this talk. So many people in my department knew about my research, and one was contacted about some interesting interactions happening in Mendocino with monarch butterflies and their caterpillars. There were adult monarchs and caterpillars in willets, and there was also a predator that they were not expecting. So I was sent this picture of an invasive praying mantis devouring a monarch caterpillar, basically skinning and gutting it and then eating it. And if anyone is a gardener here, they'll understand just how upsetting it is to watch your caterpillars get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then they just disappear. Or you come out and you see something has ripped them to shreds, and now there's just like, a wriggling mass or a little bit of guts. So I had the pleasure of being able to come and visit, and that's when I met Maricela, and we went out and looked at the Willets bypass lands, and we were able to see some places where there were a lot of monarch caterpillars, and there were milkweeds that they didn't necessarily remember, but that were native milkweeds that had appeared and that were quite loaded with caterpillars. And so in one tiny plant, I think we found 9 5th instar caterpillars, nice and plump and healthy.
Volume may be off.
Where's your volume?
Okay,
And
so somebody has not muted. Yeah, let me make sure they're muted. Okay, thank you.
so you can see in this first picture, there's, general landscape. And what was interesting is that this was a yellow jacket nest that was really close to this milkweed plant with caterpillars, and it had been recently dug up by a black bear. And I found it interesting that there could be such a large yellow jacket colony right next to this plant loaded with caterpillars, and that they survived just fine. So I will come back to that at the end when we talk a little bit more about the predators of monarchs. But first, I want to kind of revisit some of the history of monarchs and milkweeds and what we know about them and why they've been something that's been classically studied in ecology. So these are a classic system for chemical defense and the evolution of chemical defenses. And the caterpillars, monarch, some at the bottom, you can see the first monarch caterpillar I ever saw in the wild in Michigan, and the native prairie landscape that it had been in at the time. And larvae exclusively consume milkweeds, mainly but not entirely in the genus Asclepias. And there's a pretty large range of plant traits that are present in this range of milkweeds that the caterpillars will eat. And they can vary greatly in the defensive chemistry and other plant traits. So the larvae sequester cardenaloids from the milkweed, and then they in turn use that to protect themselves against predators. And you can see this classic picture of a jay that has decided to eat a tasty monarch and then later has vomited. But this all depends upon a learned avoidance, and then these general trends of aposomatic or kind of warning coloration that many of these toxic species have. So people are probably most familiar with monarchs when they think about the eastern monarch population and the amazing migration that happens every year. And I know I first heard about this when I was in 4th grade, and that was during the original Reading Rainbow. And I remember sitting in my elementary school and watching an episode of this in 4th grade and thinking, I have to go there someday. So I was eventually able to go during the time I was a middle school teacher. And you can see these pictures are what it looks like on probably an average year, right as the monarchs are starting to fly around in nectar as the conditions warm up in Mexico. And all 3 of these pictures are at the El Rosario Reserve in Michoacan, Mexico. The other thing we tend to think about is the caterpillar milkweed stage that is people learn about a lot in the East Coast, and especially up into the Midwest. And we think of these classic prairie landscapes, usually with this one species of native milkweed, and not in terribly like high density, but we think of caterpillars and the successive generations. What we don't talk about as much up until recently are the Western monarch butterflies. And so you can see in this picture, we have all of the overwintering locations for the Western monarchs. And these are from the west of the Rockies. But their historical distribution of both the butterflies, the overwintering sites, and the milkweeds is still actually poorly understood. They overwinter in coastal California and far northern Baja California and Mexico. But a lot of these really large colonies are in kind of the Bay Area and Central California. But something many people don't know are that sometimes the Western monarchs can mix with the Eastern population. And a relatively recent study has found that despite there being some documented morphological differences, that population genetic studies have found that there's essentially no genetic differentiation between this Eastern and the Western population, meaning they're the same thing, but what they do and where they go appear so different. And a fun fact that I didn't even know for a while is that monarchs aren't just a US thing. So they have been introduced throughout the Pacific, and they've colonized a number of islands in the past. And they've formed what we call these resident year-round populations. And these historic populations have often followed kind of this boom and bust cycle where you'll have the introduction of a milkweed plant, and then you'll have the introduction of monarch butterflies, and the caterpillars will completely defoliate the plants, and then you'll have a massive decrease in monarchs. This was true in many of these islands, and in Hawaii, Asclepias curassavica, the tropical milkweed a lot of people talk about and a lot of people really hate, was introduced in the 1840s, and monarch butterflies followed after. But interestingly enough, there are some locations that claim that monarchs are native to places in the Pacific. For example, in New Zealand, despite these early accounts being in maybe the early mid-1800s, the Maori have a name for monarchs, and many, like tribal elders, consider it to be an endemic or native species. So some of, there's, as you'll find in these discussions of monarchs, there is kind of a history that people like to tell, but that isn't necessarily always what the reality is, and there are a lot of unanswered questions. And why most people are probably aware of the Western monarchs today is the year 2020. So before we had these Western monarch counts, and you can see that what we usually hear about, or we usually just see a graph of this time period from 2015 to 2020. We usually don't see all of this time in between 1997 or 2000 up to 2015. And what has happened is that there's been an increase in the years of the number of overwintering sites that have been counted in what's called the Thanksgiving count. And there's been, in a lot of these years, a decrease, in one year, a catastrophic decrease in the number of adult monarchs counted at these overwintering sites. But I think something to think about when you're looking at these graphs is that there were not any standardized counts until the 1980s. And the formal counts only began in 1997. And the written accounts of overwintering monarchs in Monterey and Santa Cruz, there's some from the 1860s, 1870s, but a lot of the information and the counting methodology has changed over the years. Also, it's something to consider that this is looking at one stage of the monarch life cycle. The adults that are overwintering at these select locations that are counted usually in the Thanksgiving count and then later on in the New Year's count. And we get some interesting information from the New Year's count, including the impacts of large storms. So after you've thought about the graph that kind of brought everything to the news, I want to go over a little bit about the threats that our Western monarchs are facing. And what I see is kind of the division of the main problems. So the first is what a lot of people call the milkweed argument. And there are some prominent caterpillar experts that do not agree that milkweed is a limiting factor. But here you can see there's been efforts to document the historic distribution of different milkweed species. And the argument is that there's been a loss of this habitat, which is so essentially habitat loss and degradation. But habitat loss specifically of the milkweed plant. The milkweed plant that has that is required for monarchs to breed. And there's been efforts to document this historic range. And there's also been efforts to look at these expanding ranges. So as we think about climate change, we think about things like how not just how ranges are contracting, but also how they might be expanding, and how we might consider climate change scenarios in the future and plan with climate change adaptations and think about where monarchs might move in the past. And this has been interesting to me because if you see there's some tiny little dots up by northern Idaho, eastern Washington. And I think it was only this last summer that I saw an adult monarch flying around in my hometown of Spokane, Washington. And I grew up there, and I don't recall ever seeing one except for maybe in some places in central Washington as a college student. But there's also been an increase of visible milkweed around there. And that's interesting to me because as someone that grew up in an area and was always aware of whatever native plants were around, especially any ones that produced big fluffy seeds, I don't think that I would have missed them. But so this is something to think about, that ranges are changing and we don't entirely understand how. And there's been restoration and there's been widespread planting of milkweed. And so the big thing that people were told to do is plant milkweed, plant milkweed. In the times that I've done fieldwork in cities, I have been counting caterpillars, and I've had people bicycle by me saying, "Oh, I need to plant more milkweed this year." I've had people walking down the street and saying, "Yeah, count that Asclepias." I've had a male person walk down the street and say, "What are you doing to that Asclepias?" So there's quite a large public knowledge of this, and a lot of people plant milkweed. You can see in this picture, this is at a Whole Foods in Berkeley, and there's a lot of what I call mystery milkweeds there, and they're Asclepias, but then there's a cultivar name after. But I think people buying this might think they're buying a native milkweed. They might be pretty sure it's organic, but really there's not a lot of information. And that is because, especially, initially nursery plant and seed stock was primarily these non-native milkweeds, which are much easier to propagate by cuttings. And the native species, depending on the species, can be much slower growing, and they can be quite hard to germinate. There's some that require the cold moist stratification, where you put the seeds in soil in the fridge and leave them. But that's actually, people can ask me about this later if they want to. There's a lot of within the species variation in that. So it's not all of the natives that are hard to germinate and grow, but a lot of them are. And what happened then was that milkweeds were a hot commodity, and in Berkeley, at least, a lot of the nurseries would have a hard time keeping them in stock. They would sell out instantly. And I even would find that people would have hungry caterpillars, and they would be desperate to find plants within their neighborhood and their community to feed what they have. And I'm doing some research about these social processes as well. But the result is that we have little to no attention about the origin of the plants or the seeds, the genetic diversity of these plants and seeds, or the plant chemistry. And milkweeds vary a lot in their defensive plant kind of cocktail. So the cocktail that you're feeding the caterpillars maybe really don't know what it is. You could be giving them a lot of defensive compounds or not. And there's been research just in the last few years from Cornell University that has shown that not all of the cardenaloids are sequestered by caterpillars. There are some that are actually very difficult for the caterpillars to process. And so thinking about the genetic diversity and the plant traits of what you plant are important. But in the rush to get everyone engaged in plant milkweed, this is something that hasn't been really considered. especially if you wanted to buy seeds, that was difficult. I remember when I first started trying to buy native milkweed seeds a number of years ago, they were all sold out. There were some I was determined to find, and I could not find them anywhere for the life of me. So, and basically after these different management suggestions that are, well-intentioned, gardeners have planted a lot of milkweed. That means there's a lot of non-native milkweed, multiple species, and there's a lot of native milkweeds that have unknown origins and correspondingly have unknown kind of plant trait qualities. There's even some that people really, really like to plant that I'm convinced the caterpillars really, really dislike. And that I've had gardeners say, oh, have you seen, this one cultivar of this native? It's so great and it has beautiful flowers. And I'm kind of saying, like, well, I think people, they really, really hate it, actually. So this has been quite complex. And there's been further recommendations for people to change what they're growing, period. And there's been some where people have been told not to plant milkweed, period, in particular areas relative to the coast. And, it's still actually not been clear to me the exact motivation or rationale behind it. But you have in total now a lot of concerns about non-native milkweeds. And people are concerned about the impacts of non-natives on migration patterns, diapause, or kind of how they're overwintering, and disease. And this has led to this new push to grow natives, but there hasn't necessarily been really clear directives that are based in specific locations that people can use to inform what exactly they should do. And I kind of describe it as lots of well-intentioned people that they really, really want to do the right thing, but you're getting all of these conflicting messages and they're changing every year. And even myself as a gardener, I think, well, why am I being told this? This doesn't make sense. Or, where's the logic behind this? So result has now been, there's been a lot of lobbying to ban some things. And one, which I think was, was great, is that there's been a change in some of the pesticide regulations that nurseries have to follow. But there's also been these peculiar county level bans on the sale and commercial propagation of this one specific non-native milkweed, the tropical milkweed. There have not been, to my knowledge, corresponding bans on all of the other non-native tropical milkweeds that are planted. But there's been this focus. And I talked to a news agency, and a number of other biologists did, about the ban, because you couldn't really see the logic behind it necessarily. But I think this all shows that people want to do the right thing, and that we have a tendency to decide one thing's the right thing to do and just go full force without necessarily thinking about each locality and what the ecology of that location is. And we also, I don't think, listen enough to gardeners who see what happens every day in their gardens. And so I've noticed that in recent years, and this is from this last fall, there have been milkweeds in places where I have never seen them. So some of these areas are very, very high elevation in the Sierra Nevada. Strangely, they are along highways. And this is in late October, and they're still quite green and going to seed. But I suspect that well-intentioned people threw some seeds out of their car, but I had not recalled seeing these species or these plants on these routes that I had traveled for many years. And I also saw, a monarch at an adult at quite high elevation, which I was not used to seeing. So in these gardens, now you've started seeing that people will put out signs that tell people what to do and to be aware that, some plants have been in the past sprayed with BT to control light brown apple moth, which is also a type of caterpillar. So those are harmful to monarchs. And you see these different management things, but what is concerning is that many of these plants we buy, whether they're native or non-native, are treated with pesticides, and not just BT, because myself and other researchers have found that there are large concentrations of pesticides in milkweeds, and they will kill the caterpillars. And in fact, there's a group that I listened to one of their talks right before this paper came out that found that some of the plants that were labeled pesticide free actually had higher concentrations of pesticides in them than plants that weren't labeled. And so there's this whole supply chain, and it's very difficult to know what actually you're putting in your garden. And you could be planting a native milkweed that could have been treated with a lot of pesticides, and it could kill all of your caterpillars, unfortunately. So that brings us to kind of one of these other threats, is the idea of these resident populations. And this is what I think people have really focused on in the Bay Area, is they're concerned about these non-native milkweeds and the resident populations. And these are populations that do not migrate, and they breed year-round. And you can see two non-native milkweeds at the side. And these already exist in South Florida, the Carolinas, Georgia, Southern California, Hawaii, and the Pacific. And from early in my talk, you see that there has been, going back into the mid-1800s, cycles of booms and busts of monarchs being introduced and eating a non-native plant in a place they're introduced to, and then dying back and kind of having the cycle. The newest resident population is in the Bay Area, which I started studying shortly before the 2020 crash in the Western population. So a concern is that these populations often have high rates of the OE parasite. And the concern is that this winter foliage, and actually some natives stay green as well, depending on the species, that this foliage is not cut back, and that it could have higher concentrations of the OE parasite spore, which would then remain until the next season. And there's a lot of data about this, but conflicting opinions on how important of role it is. Something that is my focus, and I think is the main threat in my garden and general region, is predation. That you have caterpillars, and sometimes they just suddenly disappear, and you'll see this lovely caterpillar and you come out and it's gone. And there are both native and non-native predators of monarch caterpillars. And despite what we hear about how toxic and icky they are, there are plenty of things that eat them. And these predators might vary from garden to garden. And so one thing I think is really important from my own research is to think about what this larger ecological community is like, and what is the community in your garden. Okay. So next, I'm going to give you a pretty brief overview of what my research is focused on for my dissertation. And then I'm going to make sure at the end to have a lot of time where we can start having a discussion and talking about what's going on in our own gardens, and how that might vary from region to region, and how to think about our gardens and the recommendations, not as just something that's black or white one way or another, but where there might be some nuance to consider. So the first part of my dissertation is that when everything was in lockdown, I had a lot of time to walk in my neighborhood. That was one thing that you couldn't stop people from doing, is going on a walk. And so I started documenting the milkweed gardens that are in these areas in the East Bay. And I wanted to understand what the species composition of these milkweed gardens is. And how common are these gardens? And how these gardens have changed over time from 2020 through 2022. And you can see this is one garden that is a really, really dedicated gardener, and they have a mixture of native and non-native. And that's often what I find is people plant a mixture of things. And this was kind of the focus of my area, San Francisco Bay, the East Bay. And then there's this larger area that is actually quite close to two overwintering sites. They're smaller overwintering sites, but there are two in this region. The second part of my dissertation was to look at the management of these non-native milkweeds in this system and to understand what people were actually doing and whether or not people are cutting back milkweed and whether or not it's actually dying back. And what I found was, there's a pretty big range. I won't go into too much detail as I'm preparing this for publication, but you have people that don't touch them all winter. There's kind of some in between, and then you have people that keep them pruned right down to the ground. What you also have is a lot of people that will kind of herd their caterpillars and move them to one plant and then, adjust their cutting schedule. And the next component of my dissertation was trying to figure out what in the heck is eating them, because I would have a lot of caterpillars and then they would be gone. And there was a lot of anecdotal gardener reports of certain insects killing the caterpillars. But because most people are not entomologists, they're not necessarily going to be able to look at a flying insect and determine what its species is, especially because the coloration pattern and sometimes the flight pattern is quite similar between species. So I did a host of these predation experiments in which, with proper permitting and everything, I had reared caterpillars that were reared on pesticide-free, OE-free milkweeds in a greenhouse setting. And then I put them on these presentation plants to be able to see how they interacted with other species. I would put the caterpillars in these gardens, kind of replicating some similar experiments that have been done in the East Coast. And I also decided to videotape these so that I could be able to look back at them again, but to look at some details of the behavior of the predators. And some of these were in my own garden and other residential gardens in the system, which is what, the real habitat is. They were in green strips where you can see in this picture on the far right, that one's just sitting in a green strip of a gardener who gave me permission. And this has a lot of complications because people will constantly ask you what you're doing, and they will want to tell you everything they can about their own gardens and their own milkweed and what predators are there. And every once in a while, you'll have someone who I had to chase down someone once because he picked up my camera and started walking away, and he thought that it was in a free pile. So there are some really unique challenges to doing research in these urban settings, but this is where actually the ecology is happening. So there were some also a little bit easier to control, but some of these systems were in campus gardens, especially pollinator gardens. And they had kind of a similar assemblage of mostly native plants in the pollinator gardens, but also non-natives. And in some places, a mixture of more agricultural food crops and milkweed. And you can see this is kind of my setup here. But this data I'm preparing for publication right now, but what I found in my system is that the big predator and the big thing that was killing our caterpillars was this invasive paper wasp, the European paper wasp. And this has been studied in other areas and found to be, you know, a really effective predator. And what I think is concerning is that to many people, and I can't see hands raised right now, but I would think many people would think that this looks like a yellow jacket, but this is actually an invasive predator. And it's an invasive predator that does very well and that is remarkably effective. And you can see here that it's killed the caterpillar and now is skinning it and gutting it. And you can see here some remnants of caterpillars that have been attacked. But my big finding is that these introduced insect predators are very effective. And so for my system, I think instead of focusing on non-native milkweeds and OE or telling people to pull out their milkweeds, I think we should be more concerned about these expanding invasive predators and the things that we can do to try to control them and teach people to identify them. And it's actually they're quite difficult to control, and that's, you know, an ongoing area of study for me. But what I did notice also is that sometimes the caterpillars disappear, but after a lot of observation, I can tell that it was not a paper wasp. And so I decided to take a Wise little security camera connected to an external battery pack and just set up this relatively, you know, cheap setup that if somebody stole it, it wouldn't be a terrible thing. And to set this up in some locations to see just what else might be eating them. And this will bring me to, this is a video, this is a picture of my own garden. And you can see I have a mixture of native and non-native plants. I'm a plant geek, so I have a lot of weird, rare plants and things that are sentimental. But if you draw your attention to kind of this narrow leaf milkweed in the front that's by the purple alyssum, and then on the side there's a large lavender plant. And if you look up in this, I believe a Norfolk pine, you'll see a little blue scrub jay. And I'm going to start this video so you can see what my camera picked up. I feel like it's taunting me now. Now watch that area by the lavender. There's a fat 5th instar caterpillar on there. And it just in one hop jumps up and gobbles it up. And this caterpillar that I reared from an egg is now in its belly, which is very frustrating. So I also noticed that things disappeared overnight. And I would also notice some damage to the milkweed plants. Here you can see there's this cut in another, there's a branch removed and put in the base of a different plant. And I set up the same kind of portable setup, but with night vision and motion detection. And the videos aren't the best, but here in the front, you can see a native predator, another native, a dusky-footed wood rat. And this little jerk found my milkweed with caterpillars on it, and it proceeded to climb up all the plants in the pots and nibble up every one. And sometimes it took a branch as kind of a, a to-go snack, and then went into a pot and ate them there. So this, after, a lot of observation, is what's happening in my system. But I next want to have people think about what's happening in your garden. And we've talked about these larger threats that people discuss: habitat loss, both milkweed loss and overwintering loss, climate change and changes in the seasonality and the migration patterns of monarchs, and also changes in the milkweed. And another thing to think of is some of these large storms we're having. The OE parasite and concerns over these non-native milkweeds and their role in potentially increasing the amount of parasite spores. Pesticides, including in these purchased plants, even in the native plants that we then plant and feed to our caterpillars. And predators. There are also, in some places, there's parasitoids that might be the most common thing, but there are some invasive insects that are quite ruthless predators. But I like to have people think that each garden is different, and you have the opportunity to be a scientist. And your observations, if you're a gardener, or even if you're just walking around in your neighborhood or in the wilderness, they are valid, and you have, a lot more knowledge than you might realize. And I think that paying attention to what is happening in each system and thinking about how these patterns might change can lead to us having better management practices. And hopefully we can move away from just saying, let's ban this plant, you're not allowed to sell it, or rip out those plants, or monarchs must live in this location and they must follow this plan. Perhaps we can go beyond that to think about our changing world and our changing gardens and habitats, and how we can observe and learn about what things to prioritize in our garden. And the great thing about monarchs is many of the things that we can do will actually protect many other butterfly and insect species, many of which are more threatened than monarchs. And so, there might be the one everybody loves, but there's lots of others that can get protection from this umbrella species. And with that, I am going to stop share. I wanted to be able to see everyone's face